Welcome back to Erie Hour. Tonight we are heading into the dark waters of sea-bound horror with 10 of the most disturbing true cruise ship horror stories. These terrifying accounts come from passengers, workers, and people who know ships well. People who lived through something on these floating cities that changed how they see ocean travel forever. Each story is a real nightmare that happened far out at sea, where help is hundreds of miles away and normal rules of society no longer matter. From stalkers roaming shadowy hallways to crew members uncovering deadly secrets below deck, tonight's collection shows the grim reality hiding beneath the bright marketing of cruise vacations. These are not made-up tales or campfire stories, but real experiences from people who went through pure terror while trapped on the open ocean. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Untold Fears for daily true horror content that brings to light the darkest truths kept hidden in plain view. Tap that notification bell so you never miss when we reveal the horrors the tourism world tries so hard to hide. Now let us begin this journey into the abyss, where comfort turns into nightmare, and the sea locks away its darkest truths forever. Like a lot of people in their 20s, I thought going on a cruise would be the perfect way to celebrate finishing college. I loved traveling alone and had saved for months to take this Caribbean trip. As anyone who has been on a cruise knows, they are like small cities floating in the ocean, packed with thousands of strangers. And back in 2019, security was not nearly as strong as cruise lines claim. Some very troubling things happen on those ships. People going missing, assaults ignored, and staff looking the other way when guests complained. Most of it was hidden by company rules made to protect money instead of people. My name is Madison, and at 22, I thought nothing could happen to me. I had just graduated summa cum laude from Northwestern with a journalism degree. This 7-day Western Caribbean cruise was my gift to myself before starting low-level reporting jobs. I booked a solo interior cabin on the Carnival Vista, which seemed smart for my budget at the time. What I didn't know was that choice nearly cost me my life. If the ship's security hadn't been so weak, if the confusing layout hadn't made things easy for someone to follow me, if I hadn't been so unaware of the predators who look for women traveling alone on these ships, what happened during those 7 days would never have gotten as bad as it did. But cruise companies earn billions by selling the image of safety while failing to protect those most at risk. The first day felt magical. I walked across every deck, took photos of the endless ocean, and felt that powerful freedom of being away from normal life. The ship carried over 4,000 passengers and 1,500 crew members, and I liked the feeling of blending into the crowd. I ate at the buffet, saw the welcome show, and went to bed excited about our first port stop in Cozumel. That was when I first noticed him. His name was Kyle. He introduced himself when I was grabbing coffee on deck 5. He looked mid-30s, average height, thin brown hair, pale blue eyes that seemed to notice everything. He wore a faded Hawaiian shirt and khaki shorts, the outfit of a middle-aged tourist trying too hard to look easygoing. At first, he seemed harmless. He said he was traveling alone too, newly divorced and trying to find himself at sea. We talked maybe 15 minutes about ports and ship activities. He seemed to know a lot about cruising, saying it was his 4th time on the same ship. He told me the best photo spots, which restaurants had short lines, and which staff were friendliest. I thought it was nice to meet someone who could help me since I was new to cruise travel. But even then, something felt off about him. He asked too many personal questions: where I was from, what I did for work, whether I was truly alone. When I mentioned just graduating, his eyes lit up in a way that made my skin prickle. He also stood too close while talking, and I noticed his eyes flicking toward my key card when I pulled it out. I brushed off the red flags, telling myself he was just awkward from divorce. On the second day, Kyle started showing up everywhere. When I relaxed by the pool, he was suddenly at the nearby bar. At the gym, he picked a treadmill with a full view of me. At lunch, he passed my table again and again with that strange smile. I started to feel watched, but told myself it was just coincidence. After all, a ship has limited places to go, so maybe it was natural for solo travelers to cross paths. On the third day, we stopped in Jamaica. I joined a group excursion to climb Dunn's River Falls. Coming back, as our group walked to the ship, I saw Kyle waiting at the pier. He wasn't part of the excursion, which meant he had come there just to watch people return. When he spotted me, he waved and rushed over to ask about my day. The fact that he knew exactly when I'd be back, though I had never told him my plans, chilled me. That evening, I chose a specialty restaurant to avoid the main dining areas. I booked the steakhouse on deck 8 and asked for a corner table so I could see who came in. For the first time in days, I felt calm. But as I finished dessert, Kyle showed up at my table. He wasn't dressed for the upscale place, still in his Hawaiian shirt and shorts, but somehow he was seated. He claimed it was pure chance we both chose the same spot. He asked to join me for a drink, and when I politely said no, his face darkened briefly before snapping back to a smile. He insisted on walking me to my cabin, calling it the gentlemanly thing. My gut told me to refuse, but fear held me back. So I let him come with me through twisting hallways, downstairs and into the maze of interior cabins on deck 2. As we walked, Kyle spoke about the ship's confusing layout, pointing out how easy it would be to get lost late at night when most passengers were asleep. He noted that my cabin section was especially quiet, away from main halls and elevators. He even mentioned my exact room location at the end of a dead-end hallway, calling it cozy but cut off. The way he described it with such detail told me he had been studying where I stayed. This wasn't small talk. It was someone gathering information. When we reached my door, he didn't leave. He lingered in the narrow hall, asking about my plans for the next day, whether I'd go ashore in Grand Cayman or stay on the ship. When I gave vague replies, he pressed for details, what activities I liked, what time I slept. His questions felt sharp, and I could feel sweat forming even in the cool air. I managed to excuse myself and slipped inside, locking the deadbolt and chain. Through the peephole, I saw Kyle still standing there for nearly 10 minutes, staring at my door. He leaned closer at times, as if listening for sound. I swear I heard him test the door handle. That night I barely slept. Every noise in the hall made me freeze. The normal creaks of the ship sounded like footsteps outside. Around 2 a.m., I heard something that seemed like someone trying to slide something under my door. But when I finally gathered the courage to look, there was nothing there. I stayed awake the rest of the night, holding my phone tightly in case I had to call security if Kyle tried something worse. The next morning, I went straight to guest services to report what had been happening. The young woman at the counter listened, but her face showed no real concern. She said that people traveling alone often misunderstand friendly behavior, and that Kyle was probably just trying to be nice because he was lonely as well. When I told her clearly that his actions felt predatory and asked if they could move me to another cabin, she said the ship was fully booked and there were no other rooms. She did agree to write a note in Kyle's file, but made it very clear that unless he physically hurt me, there was nothing security would step in to do. She suggested I avoid him and stay in crowded areas until the cruise was over. The way she brushed off my fear made me realize I was completely on my own. For the next 2 days, I did everything I could to follow her advice. I spent time in the busiest areas of the ship during the day, never went to the quiet decks, and avoided walking anywhere alone at night. But no matter how careful I was, Kyle somehow always appeared, watching me, following from a distance, never far away. On our last night at sea, the ship held a big farewell party on the Lido deck. I thought this would be the safest place to spend the evening. Hundreds of people all around, bars open, food stands busy, constant movement. I wore my most modest clothes and stood near the center of the deck, away from exits and darker corners. The party was loud, filled with music, dancing, and laughter. But across the deck, I saw Kyle. He wasn't celebrating, wasn't drinking or talking to anyone. He was just standing by the railing, eyes locked on me. Even in that packed crowd, I could feel his stare pressing down on me. When I moved to another part of the deck, he moved too, keeping that same direct gaze. By around 11 p.m., I couldn't take it anymore. Days of fear had drained me, and my body felt sick from the stress. I decided I would go back, pack my bags, and spend the last few hours in the 24-hour cafe where there were always people around. I took a winding path toward the elevators, keeping to busy parts of the ship. But when I stepped into the grand atrium on deck 5, I saw that most passengers had already left for their cabins or late-night bars. The huge, elegant space that had looked so beautiful on day 1 now felt cold and unsafe. I pressed the elevator button, watching the numbers slowly come down. Behind me, I heard footsteps on the marble floor, but when I turned, the atrium looked empty except for a couple of crew members cleaning. The footsteps stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes watching me from the higher balconies above. Finally, the elevator arrived, and I stepped inside, pressing for deck 2. Just as the doors were closing, a hand pushed through. Kyle stepped in, smiling that same fake smile, but this time his eyes looked different, sharp, predatory, certain. "Heading to your room, Madison?" he asked, even though I hadn't said a word about where I was going. "Maybe we could have a nightcap before we say goodbye tomorrow." My stomach dropped. I told him no and quickly tried to press for another deck, hoping to get out and escape. But Kyle shifted his body in front of the buttons, trapping me in the corner. The elevator started down, and I realized he had planned this moment. "You've been avoiding me," he said in a wounded, almost childlike tone. "I thought we were becoming friends. I wanted us to have some real time together. Just us." The way he stressed real time made me shiver. I told him again I wasn't interested, that his behavior was scaring me, and that I wanted him to leave me alone. He just laughed, but there was nothing warm in the sound. "Come on, Madison," he whispered, stepping closer. "Don't be like that. You're all alone on this big ship, and so am I. We should be there for each other." The elevator reached deck 2, and the doors opened onto the narrow, dim corridor that led to my cabin. Kyle gestured for me to step out first, but I refused. The hallway was empty, and I knew that if I walked out, I'd be completely alone with him in one of the most isolated parts of the ship. Suddenly, Kyle grabbed my wrist and yanked hard, trying to pull me out. His grip was crushing, leaving marks on my skin. I screamed and fought to get free, but he was far stronger than I expected. He hissed at me to stop making a scene, saying I was overreacting. Just as he pulled harder toward the hallway, the elevator doors began closing again because someone had called it from another floor. Kyle had to make a split-second choice between holding me and stopping the doors. In that tiny moment, I ripped free and pressed myself against the back wall. His face changed instantly, the awkward, friendly mask gone, leaving behind a cold, calculated look. He lunged at me, fingers scraping the metal doors as they closed him out. I stayed in that elevator riding up and down for nearly an hour, too terrified to get off anywhere he might be waiting. Finally, I stepped out on deck 9, where the 24-hour pizza stand still had people eating. I hid in a corner booth, jumping at every movement, staring at the doorway. The next morning, as the ship docked in Miami, I saw Kyle one last time. He was by the gangway, scanning the crowd. When his eyes met mine, he smiled and waved like nothing had happened, as if he hadn't stalked me for 7 days or tried to drag me into that hallway. I reported everything to the port authorities, but they told me that since no crime had technically taken place and we were off the ship, they couldn't act. The cruise line's cameras only showed silent footage of us talking, with no audio to reveal his threatening tone or my discomfort. From that day forward, I've never taken another cruise and never plan to again. That trip taught me that these ships are perfect hunting grounds for predators who know how to use isolation and company policies to their advantage. Kyle is likely out there now, targeting another woman traveling alone, someone just celebrating a milestone or looking for a little freedom. If you ever find yourself on a cruise and someone makes you uneasy, trust your gut. Don't waste time being polite or worried about hurting feelings. Your safety comes first, always. Out at sea, help is very far away. My name is Trevor Jameson, and I have worked on cruise ships for over 10 years. I have witnessed things that could make your blood run cold, but nothing compared to what I saw while working the night shift on Deck 7 aboard the Royal Caribbean Anthem of the Seas. Passengers rarely see the crew-only areas of these huge ships, and they have no idea what happens in those narrow corridors and service zones when the rest of the ship is asleep. If they did, the entire cruise industry would collapse overnight. I started working on cruise ships when I was 24, fresh out of a failed marriage and desperate for a new start. The money was decent. You got to see the world. And best of all, you could run from your problems for months at a time. What nobody warns you about when you sign that contract is that sometimes people vanish for good, and the company has very strict ways of making sure those disappearances never show up in any official records. For 8 years, I worked nights on the maintenance crew, which gave me access to almost every part of the ship except the bridge and the captain's rooms. My job was to fix whatever broke between midnight and 6 a.m. before the day crew took over. Broken air conditioners, leaking pipes, elevators stuck between decks, wiring issues that couldn't wait. If it happened overnight, it was mine to handle. Most nights went by without much, but cruise ships are huge machines with endless parts, and something always breaks. The cruise sections of a ship look nothing like the shiny passenger areas. No marble floors or fancy chandeliers where we worked. Just narrow metal hallways with exposed pipes, buzzing fluorescent lights that flicker nonstop, and the deep hum of engines moving the ship through the sea at 20 knots. The air stank of cleaner mixed with fuel, and the walls shook with vibration. If crew were free to report every strange disappearance they witnessed, if we could tell the truth about what happens on night shifts, if the company didn't lock us down with contracts and non-disclosure agreements that could ruin our lives, the cruise industry would collapse overnight. But they pay us enough to stay quiet, and they make it clear. Speak out, and you'll never work on another ship again. It was during my 3rd year on the Anthem when I began noticing the pattern. Passengers would board at the start of the trip, but by the last day, their cabin would be empty, even though their bags were still there. The official excuse was always the same. They had a family emergency and got off at one of the ports. But I started paying attention to which rooms went vacant, and I saw it was always the same kind. Solo travelers tucked away in interior cabins, far from the busy decks. Those rooms are the cheapest because they're hidden in the middle of the ship. No windows, no balcony. They're fine for people who just need a bed and don't care about the view. They're also perfect for passengers who vanish without anyone noticing. The first time I learned what really happened to these early departures was on a 7-night Eastern Caribbean cruise in October 2018. I was doing my rounds around 3 a.m. when I heard voices echoing from one of the service hallways near the medical bay on deck 3. That hallway was supposed to be crew only, locked off from passengers. At first I thought maybe a drunk guest had wandered down there by mistake, so I walked closer quietly. But the voices belonged to crew, not lost tourists. I recognized one of them right away, Marcus Webb, a security officer who'd worked with the company for nearly 15 years. The other voice was new to me, but his uniform showed he worked in guest services. They were talking about a passenger named Patricia Coleman, a 62-year-old widow from Ohio who had booked a solo cruise to celebrate her retirement. From their conversation, I learned Patricia had been asking too many questions about another passenger who had supposedly gotten off the ship in Jamaica. Patricia had been friends with that woman, and when she couldn't reach her after the cruise ended, she started asking around. She had already gone to guest services 3 times demanding answers. The guest services officer said, "She knows that woman never left the ship. She's threatening to file a missing person report when we get back to Port Everglades." What Marcus said next froze me in place. "Patricia Coleman won't be filing any reports," he answered flatly. "She's going to have an accident tonight. Slip and fall on deck 12 near the rail. Too much to drink at the casino, wandered outside in the dark, lost her balance." I pressed myself against the wall, barely breathing. They spoke so calmly as if they were planning maintenance instead of killing a woman. They went over the details, the exact time, how the cameras would be switched off in that area, which crew would handle cleanup. The guest services officer reminded Marcus that her cabin had to be emptied before we got back to port, and that her luggage would be handled the same way they always did in these cases. He also pointed out that Patricia had paid by credit card and hadn't bought travel insurance, which meant fewer complications with her estate. After about 10 minutes, they finished their meeting and went their separate ways. I stayed hidden in that hallway for another 30 minutes, my heart beating so hard I thought the sound would give me away. When I was sure they were gone, I went back to my work area, trying to make sense of what I had just heard. I knew I should tell someone, but who could I trust? If Marcus Webb was part of killing passengers, then how many other security officers were also involved? If guest services was helping cover it up, then how far up the company did this go? And the biggest question, if I spoke out, would I be the next one to vanish? The rest of that night, I could not focus on fixing anything. Every dark corner looked dangerous. Every noise made me jump. I kept thinking about Patricia Coleman, likely asleep in her room, not knowing her trip of celebration was about to end in her death. At around 5 a.m., as my shift was ending, the ship's emergency alarm went off. A message came over the speakers saying there had been an incident on deck 12 and that passengers should stay inside their rooms while the situation was being dealt with. I instantly knew what it was, but I had no power to stop it. The official report later said Patricia Coleman had fallen overboard between 4 and 5 a.m. while walking alone on the upper deck. The cameras in that section were not working, so there was no video. Her body was never found, even though the Coast Guard searched for hours. Her family was told she had been drinking heavily in the casino and likely got lost in the dark. But I knew none of that was true. Patricia Coleman had not slipped. She had been murdered by the crew, part of a secret plan to get rid of passengers who asked too many questions or noticed too much. Her death was no accident. It was carefully arranged to protect money and keep the image of safety that sells tickets. Over the following 2 years, I saw or heard about at least 6 more so-called accidents with solo travelers who had caused problems for the company. An old man who complained about food poisoning supposedly fell downstairs. A middle-aged woman who reported being assaulted by a crew member supposedly died of a heart attack. A young student who claimed he saw drugs being sold by the staff disappeared. His room cleared out and his records changed so it looked like he was never there at all. Each time it was staged to look like natural causes or bad luck. Security cameras always stopped working at just the right moment. The medical reports always said no foul play. Families were quietly given small settlements so lawsuits would not happen. I came to understand these ships were not fun resorts. They were prisons on water where the company could remove anyone who was a danger to their profits. Being out in international waters meant no real law was there to check. Passengers were not being protected. They were being watched, controlled, and removed if needed. The breaking point for me came during my last contract in early 2020. I was told to clean out the cabin of a passenger who had supposedly left early in Cozumel. But when I opened the closet, I found a leather journal that had been missed during the cleanup. It belonged to a retired detective named Robert Shaw. His last notes detailed his investigation into the disappearance of his daughter on a cruise months earlier. According to what he wrote, Robert Shaw booked this trip only to find out the truth about his 25-year-old daughter Jessica, who had vanished during a Caribbean cruise half a year earlier. He had been interviewing crew, checking the official stories, and finding holes in all of them. His final entry, just 2 days before his early departure, said he had proof of a murder operation running inside the cruise industry. His journal listed names, dates, and described at least 12 strange deaths tied to different cruise lines. He had enough to bring down the whole operation, but somehow they found out about him and silenced him before he could go public. I photographed every page of that journal and uploaded it to a secure cloud account. Then I resigned immediately and left the ship at the next port. I have never worked on another cruise since then, and for 5 years I have lived in fear that they will track me down and silence me like they did Robert Shaw, Patricia Coleman, and the others. The cruise business makes billions every year selling people the dream of safe, glamorous travel across the ocean. But the truth is darker. These ships are places without real law, where money is worth more than lives, and anyone who threatens that dream can vanish forever. The next time you think of booking a cruise, remember it is not just a holiday. It is stepping into a place where your life has a price, and that price might be lower than you realize. So I have always been claustrophobic, which is why booking an interior cabin on a 14-day transatlantic cruise was probably the worst decision I have ever made. But my wife, Jessica, insisted we needed to save money for our honeymoon trip, and the interior rooms were almost half the price of the ocean view cabins. What seemed like smart budgeting turned into a nightmare that still haunts me 3 years later. My name is Marcus Thompson, and I am 28 years old. Jessica and I had been together since college, and this cruise from New York to Southampton was supposed to be the romantic start to our married life together. We had spent months planning every detail from the formal night outfits to the shore excursions in the Azores. What we had not planned for was discovering that our floating honeymoon suite was built on top of a crime scene that the cruise line had covered up for decades. If that cabin door lock had not malfunctioned during the storm on our 5th night at sea, if the maintenance crew had not taken 3 hours to respond to our emergency call, if we had not been trapped in that claustrophobic metal box while the ship pitched violently through 20-foot swells, We never would have discovered what was hidden behind the walls of cabin 2147. Interior cabins on cruise ships are basically windowless boxes designed to maximize passenger capacity while minimizing construction costs. Our room was maybe 80 square feet in total with a tiny bathroom, two narrow beds that could be pushed together, and just enough floor space to open one suitcase at a time. The walls were covered with cheap wooden panels that tried to give a cozy, elegant look. But underneath that fake design was only cold metal and insulation. The Celebrity Eclipse was one of the newer ships in the fleet, launched in 2010 with all the latest safety upgrades and modern luxuries. But our cabin was located on deck too deep in the ship, where the constant shaking from the engines made it impossible to forget that we were trapped in a metal box far from land. The hallway outside our cabin was narrow and dimly lit with a low ceiling that made even average height people feel like they were crawling through a submarine. For the first 4 days of the cruise, everything seemed wonderful. We explored every deck, ate at all the restaurants, and spent hours up on the observation deck watching dolphins swim alongside the ship. Jessica was glowing with happiness, constantly snapping photos and saying this was the best decision we had ever made. The tight feeling I had in the cabin was bearable because we spent most of the day in public areas, only coming back to the room to sleep and change. But on the fifth night, we ran into a huge storm system that the captain had not predicted. The weather reports had only said light rain and some rough seas, but what hit us was a full North Atlantic storm with winds over 60 miles per hour and waves that rose higher than the upper decks. The ship had been built to handle storms, but nothing could have prepared us for how violent this one was. Around 10 p.m., we went back to our cabin early because Jessica was getting seasick. The public areas were almost empty since most passengers had gone back to their rooms or were battling their own motion sickness. The elevator ride down to deck 2 was terrifying, the car swaying heavily and the cables groaning under the pressure of the storm. When we reached our cabin, I slid the key card and heard the normal beep showing the lock had released. But when I tried the handle, it didn't move. The electronic lock had opened, but the mechanics seemed jammed. I tried several times, pulling and pushing on the door, while Jessica leaned against the wall to steady herself in the rolling ship. After 10 minutes of trying, Jessica suggested we call maintenance. The customer service line connected us to a stressed-sounding crew member who said they were dealing with multiple emergencies across the ship and couldn't say when someone would come. He suggested we wait in one of the lounges until the storm was over and they could handle small maintenance issues. But Jessica was getting worse by the minute, and the idea of sitting in a crowded lounge while she was violently seasick felt impossible. I told the dispatcher that my wife was sick and needed our bathroom right away. He put me on hold for several minutes and then came back saying someone would come, but it could take hours due to the storm. We had no choice but to wait in the narrow corridor, sitting on the hard carpet while the ship rocked around us. The ceiling lights flickered now and then, and we could hear the ship's structure groaning under the strain of the waves. Every few minutes, a massive swell hit, and we were thrown against the walls even though we tried to brace ourselves. Around midnight, Jessica's seasickness was so bad she was dry heaving in the hallway. I was desperate and began looking more closely at the door to see if I could force it open. That was when I noticed the wood paneling around the door frame had started to pull away from the wall, probably from the stress of the ship twisting in the storm. At first the gap was small, maybe half an inch, but as the ship strained in the heavy seas, the separation grew larger. I could see behind the paneling to the bare metal of the ship's structure, and what I saw made my blood turn cold. There were dark stains on the metal that looked like old dried blood, and scratched into the steel were markings that looked like desperate messages made by fingernails. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight to see better behind the wall.
The scratches spelled rough words like, "Help me," and they killed Sarah and room 2147, which was our exact cabin number. Below those were more stains and what looked like torn fabric stuck between the metal plates. Jessica was too sick to notice what I was finding, but I started taking photos of everything hidden behind the panels. As the storm battered the ship, more gaps appeared in the walls, showing more signs of violence that had happened right there. There were deep scratches that looked like someone had clawed at the walls in desperation, and in one corner, I saw what looked like a human tooth stuck in a dark, sticky mess. Around 2 a.m., the maintenance crew finally arrived to fix our door. The worker was a middle-aged Filipino man who looked nervous and kept glancing at the broken paneling. When I asked about the messages and stains behind the wall, his whole expression changed. He told me in broken English that I should not pay attention to those things, that they were old problems already solved. The repair of the door lock took another hour, during which I kept taking photos of the hidden evidence. The worker became more and more unsettled as he saw me documenting what we had found. He kept saying the scratched words were just graffiti from bad passengers, and the stains were old water damage. But his explanations did not match the clear signs of violence and desperation carved into the ship's metal structure. When we finally got into our cabin around 3 a.m., I started checking the walls more closely. Some of the wood panels were loose, and I pulled them back to see what was behind. What I found was disturbing. Behind the headboard of our bed, someone had scratched a long message that told the story of a woman named Sarah Martinez, who had been murdered in this cabin during a Caribbean cruise in 2015. The message said, Sarah was a 26-year-old teacher from Phoenix who had taken a solo cruise to celebrate a new job. She had been given cabin 2147, the same room where Jessica and I were supposed to enjoy our honeymoon. On the fourth night of her trip, Sarah caught her cabin steward stealing from passengers and selling the items to other crew. When she confronted him, he panicked and attacked her to stop her from reporting him. The message explained how she had fought hard, scratching at the walls and trying to scream, while he strangled her with a towel. Her body was cut apart in the small bathroom, and the pieces were sent out through the ship's waste system in the middle of the night. The worst part was that Sarah had stayed alive for nearly an hour after the attack, injured and trapped in the room while the steward planned how to get rid of her body. She had used her nails and a broken piece of mirror to scratch her story into the walls, hoping someone would one day find out what really happened. Her final line was a plea for anyone who discovered her message to contact her family in Phoenix and tell them she had not killed herself or fallen overboard. I spent the rest of the night taking pictures of everything hidden behind the panels. By morning, I had proof of a crime scene that had been covered up with new decorative walls. The cruise line had simply hidden Sarah's murder and kept renting the cabin to other guests. When Jessica felt better in the morning, I showed her the messages. She was horrified, not only by Sarah's story, but by the fact that we had been sleeping in a room where she had been attacked and killed just 3 years earlier. We both felt sick knowing the cruise line was aware of it, but had chosen to cover it up instead of investigating properly or honoring Sarah. We spent the next 9 days gathering evidence and learning more about Sarah online. We found she had been reported missing in 2015 during a Caribbean cruise, but the official report claimed she had fallen overboard after drinking too much. Her family never believed it, since Sarah rarely drank and was a strong swimmer who wouldn't have been walking the upper decks alone at night. The cruise line story said she had been seen leaving the casino at midnight and walking toward the Deck 12 promenade, but the cameras had malfunctioned before her supposed fall, and her body was never recovered despite Coast Guard searches. Her family even hired a private investigator who found many holes in the story, but they had no proof of foul play. When we returned to New York, I contacted Sarah's family in Phoenix and gave them all our evidence from cabin 2147. They were devastated, but relieved to finally know the truth. We shared our photos and helped them file a wrongful death case against the cruise line. The case lasted 2 years and ended with a private settlement, which included rules requiring the company to investigate passenger deaths properly and remember the victims instead of hiding evidence. Sarah's family used some of the money to create a foundation to help families of people who die or vanish under strange circumstances on ships. But the most important thing was that Sarah's story was finally told. The messages she scratched into the walls were not wasted, and her family finally knew she had died fighting for the truth about the violence and corruption hidden in the cruise industry. Our honeymoon was ruined by what we uncovered in cabin 2147, but we gained something bigger than romantic memories. We became a voice for someone who had been silenced, and we helped make sure her death was not meaningless. The cabin has since been renovated again, most likely destroying the last traces of Sarah's writing, but the truth of what happened in that room can never fully be erased, because now people know her story, and it will not be forgotten. If you ever stay in an interior cabin on a cruise, remember you may be sleeping in a room where someone died in violence, and the pretty walls could be hiding crimes that were never truly investigated. As a single mom, I thought the kids' club would be a blessing. My 8-year-old daughter, Lily, could make friends while I got some adult time on our 7-day Mediterranean cruise. The counselors seemed kind and professional with their polo shirts and big smiles. What I didn't know was that I was handing my child over to predators who used the kids' club as their hunting ground. My name is Angela Rodriguez. I am 35, and after my divorce 2 years ago, I had been working double shifts as a nurse. This trip was supposed to be a fresh start. Lily had been through so much from the divorce, and I thought a week of fun would help her heal. I didn't know I was putting her into something worse than anything she had gone through before. If I hadn't trusted my instincts when she started having nightmares on the third night, if I hadn't noticed her sudden changes, if I hadn't followed her when she slipped out during movie night, I would never have learned what was happening in the youth center. The Norwegian Dawn was advertised as family-friendly, with award-winning kids programs for ages 3 to 17. The youth center took most of Deck 12, with areas for different ages, games, crafts, and a small theater. 6 counselors worked there under a program director named Michael Stevens, a friendly man in his 40s who seemed to love children. On the first day, I brought Lily to register. The place was colorful, filled with cartoons and safety measures. The counselors were cheerful and quickly got Lily into games with other kids. Michael gave me a tour and explained the schedule of activities, meals, and free time. I was impressed by how organized it was. They said counselors had background checks, parents got daily reports, cameras covered the rooms, and only guardians with ID could pick up kids. It seemed like the safest place for Lily while I enjoyed a little break. For 2 days, it went great. Lily loved the club, made friends, did crafts, danced, and played games. The daily reports praised her for being kind and cheerful. She seemed happier than she had in months, and I thought I had made the right choice. But on the third morning, Lily was different. She woke from a nightmare crying, said she didn't want to go back, and told me the games were weird. She begged to stay with me, but I had already made plans with friends I'd met. I convinced her to go, and Michael reassured me it was normal for kids to feel anxious after a few days. But Lily looked more scared than just homesick. Later, when I picked her up, a counselor said she had been quiet and uncooperative. This was unlike her, and I started to worry. When I asked Lily about her day, she gave short answers and avoided eye contact. That night, she had another nightmare, but this time she remembered more. She said there was a secret room where counselors took certain kids for special games they couldn't tell parents about. She said there were cameras, but not the same ones used for security. These cameras were being run by adults who watched the children. I tried to believe she was just dreaming, but the details she described made me uneasy. She used words and phrases no 8-year-old should know, words she could not have learned on her own. When I asked where she heard them, she said one of the counselors had taught them to her during special time. The next morning, I chose to watch the kids' club more closely, before letting Lily stay there for the day. I told Michael Stevens that I wanted to sit and observe for a while because Lily was having a hard time adjusting, and he acted supportive of my decision as a parent. But as I sat in the parents' viewing area, I started noticing details I had not picked up on during my first tour of the place. For one, some sections of the youth center could not be seen from the windows, including a hallway that led to what looked like offices or storage rooms.
I also noticed that the counselors seemed to select certain kids for special attention, and they usually picked children who looked shy, nervous, or withdrawn instead of the more outgoing ones. These children were taken away from the main group for about 15 or 20 minutes at a time. When I asked Michael Stevens about it, he said they were confidence-building exercises meant to help quieter kids feel more included. He explained that some children just needed a bit of personal encouragement, and these sessions were part of their normal program. But the way he explained it felt practiced, as though he had already given the same answer many times to worried parents. I spent the entire morning just watching how the kids' club worked, and I began to see a clear pattern in which kids they picked for these so-called sessions. They seemed to focus on children traveling with single parents, especially mothers who were overwhelmed or busy with cruise activities. They also chose children who seemed lonely or had trouble making friends. Around lunchtime, I noticed one of the counselors, a young woman named Sarah Mitchell, walk over to Lily and whisper something in her ear that made her face turn pale. Sarah then held Lily's hand and guided her toward the hallway I had already noticed, the one hidden from parents' view. My instincts screamed at me to follow them, even though it meant breaking the rule about staying in the parent area. I waited for a few minutes, then told the staff at the check-in desk that I was going to the restroom. Instead of going there, I slipped quietly down the same hallway. The narrow passage led to several small rooms that looked like storage spaces or meeting rooms for staff. Most of the doors were closed, but I heard muffled voices from one room at the very end. I pressed my ear to the door as quietly as I could, trying to listen. What I heard made me feel sick with anger and fear. Sarah was speaking to Lily in a soft but manipulative voice, telling her this was a special game that would make her more liked by the other kids. She asked Lily to take off some of her clothes and pose for pictures that would be sent to friends who wanted to see how pretty she was. I could hear Lily crying softly, telling her she didn't want to play. But Sarah kept insisting it was normal, saying that all the children did it sooner or later. She warned Lily that if she refused, she wouldn't be allowed to join the fun activities and the other kids wouldn't want to be her friend. She even told Lily that if she ever told me about these games, I would be angry and punish her for causing trouble. That was the last straw. I burst through the door and found my daughter standing in the corner, wearing only her underwear, while Sarah Mitchell stood holding a camera and telling her how to pose. The room's walls were covered with photos of other kids in different stages of undress, and video equipment was set up to capture everything. At that moment, I realized this wasn't a kids' club at all. It was a carefully run operation exploiting children. Sarah tried to claim she was helping Lily with a costume change for a performance, but the truth was obvious from the images and equipment around us. I grabbed my daughter, wrapped her in my jacket, and shouted for security while Sarah tried to stop me from taking the camera as proof. Within minutes, ship security officers rushed in, but I noticed right away that they seemed more worried about calming the situation than actually investigating. The head of security, a man named Robert Walsh, started pressuring me almost immediately to stay quiet. He said contacting outside authorities would ruin the cruise for thousands of passengers and claimed the cruise line had its own way of dealing with such incidents. He even offered me a full refund and a voucher for another trip if I signed a non-disclosure agreement and let them handle it. I refused. I wasn't about to let them cover up what I had seen. As soon as we docked in Barcelona, I contacted Spanish police and the FBI to report everything. Their investigation revealed that the youth program on the Norwegian Dawn had secretly been running as a child exploitation ring for more than 2 years. Michael Stevens and 3 counselors were using their roles to abuse children and create illegal material sold online to predators around the world. Investigators also found that cruise management had already received several complaints from parents about inappropriate behavior, but had ignored or hidden them to protect the company's reputation. Some children had even tried to tell their parents about the special games, but their words had been dismissed as confusion or imagination instead of being taken seriously. In the end, 4 staff members were arrested and charged with multiple crimes. Michael Stevens was sentenced to 25 years in prison, while the others received between 10 and 15 years. The cruise line paid millions in settlements and was forced to change its child safety protocols, but for the victims, the harm could never truly be undone. Lily has been in therapy for 3 years now, trying to heal from what she went through in those few days on the ship. She still wakes from nightmares sometimes, and she has trouble trusting adults like teachers and coaches. What happened taught me that predators can hide anywhere, even in places that appear safe and well-run. If you ever take your children on a cruise, remember that your instincts as a parent are stronger than any policy or promise. Always trust your gut if something feels wrong, and never be afraid to speak up, even if it means causing a scene. Cruise companies depend on parents being quiet and agreeable, but your child's safety matters more than anyone's comfort. These ships may look like floating paradises, but they can hide horrors that stay with you forever. I'm Dr. Patricia Holloway here. I was the ship's doctor for 3 years aboard the Celebrity Constellation, and I believed I had seen every medical emergency possible at sea: heart attacks, strokes, serious injuries from accidents, alcohol poisoning, overdoses, even suicide attempts. When you're responsible for the health of 4,000 passengers and crew in the middle of the ocean, you learn to expect anything. But then came the night when a passenger was brought in with injuries that made no sense, and I realized some emergencies have nothing to do with medicine at all. I had been working on cruise ships since finishing my training at Johns Hopkins. The pay was excellent, the travel was amazing, and the work was steady but not overwhelming. Most cases were simple: seasickness, small accidents, medicine refills, or the rare emergency that needed a helicopter evacuation. Our medical bay was advanced, with equipment for tests, surgeries, and even a small morgue for passengers who passed away. If my training had not pushed me to recognize the signs of deliberate harm, if I hadn't kept records, if I had given in to the pressure from management not to dig deeper, the truth of what happened in those waters might have been buried forever. But as a doctor, I had sworn to protect my patients, even if it meant risking my career and safety. This incident happened during a 14-night transatlantic cruise from Miami to Barcelona in September 2019. We were 6 days into the trip, somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, when security brought a passenger into the medical bay around 3 a.m. The man was unconscious, bleeding badly from several head wounds, and showing signs of heavy blunt force trauma across his body. The guards who carried him in said he had fallen down a flight of stairs while drunk, but even a quick look told me his injuries did not match a fall at all. The patient's name was David Chen, a 42-year-old software engineer from San Francisco, traveling alone on his first cruise. His medical files showed he was healthy, had no drug or alcohol problems, and only used the occasional allergy pill. He had booked a small interior cabin on Deck 4 and usually kept to himself, spending time in the ship's library or walking laps on the outdoor decks. As I checked his condition more closely, I could see right away that the pattern of his injuries suggested he had been attacked. His hands and arms had clear defensive wounds, showing he had tried to shield himself. His head injuries looked like repeated blows from something heavy, not just one impact from a fall. and around his throat were bruises from strangulation, plus marks on his wrists that looked like he had been tied up. I photographed everything and wrote detailed notes, the same way I would in an ER when handling an assault case. When I called the ship's security chief to report that David had been attacked and possibly almost murdered, I was told Chief Walsh was not available and that all medical reports had to go through guest services until morning. Within minutes, a guest services officer named Lisa Martinez came to see me, but she wasn't interested in investigating. She wanted to know who else knew about David's condition and whether I had contacted anyone outside the ship. I told her I was required to report possible crimes to the proper authorities, but she insisted that because we were in international waters, all matters had to go through corporate security. While David stayed unconscious, I worked to stabilize him, treating a serious concussion, broken ribs, and internal bleeding that would need surgery soon. But while I worked, I kept asking myself why he had been attacked and who would want to harm a quiet passenger who seemed to bother no one. At around 6 a.m., David woke briefly and whispered something that shocked me. He said he had not been attacked by passengers, but by crew members, and that they found out he was not who he claimed to be. David wasn't really a software engineer on vacation. He was an undercover journalist investigating organized crime linked to cruise ships. He told me he had been researching human trafficking operations that use cruise liners to move people across borders without notice. He said he had been collecting proof for months, identifying crew members who worked with criminals to move people, drugs, and illegal cargo. On the night of his attack, he was caught taking photos of a meeting between several crew members and people who had boarded the ship secretly at the last port. These people were not travelers, but victims being trafficked. When David tried to run, he was beaten nearly to death, then brought in under the fake story of a fall. Before slipping back into unconsciousness, he begged me to contact the FBI and find the evidence he had hidden in his cabin. He told me that if he died, his death would be written off as an accident and his work would vanish with him. He made me promise not to let that happen. Over the next hours, ship management pushed me hard to rewrite my medical records to match their story of a fall. Even the captain, Robert Morrison, came down to remind me that my contract had strict confidentiality clauses and that calling the police would violate them and cost me my job. But I refused to lie. I had both a legal duty and a moral duty to record the truth, and I had made a promise to David that I would not let his discovery be buried. 3 days later, when we reached Barcelona, David was still alive but in a fragile state. I had kept him stable, but he was unconscious and badly injured. Just before he was flown to a hospital, Lisa Martinez came with a death certificate already written up, saying he died in an accident. I was stunned. They wanted me to sign a fake document even though David was still breathing. When I refused, she said he would not survive the helicopter ride anyway, and that my signature was needed to handle his remains quickly. She made it clear this wasn't optional, that if I refused, my career would suffer. At that moment, I knew I was watching a murder plan unfolding. They intended to kill him during transfer and wanted me to give it legitimacy with paperwork. I stalled, telling Martinez I needed time to check his records. Instead, I contacted the FBI through the ship's satellite link. I sent them my full report, photographs of the injuries, and everything David had told me. I gave them his cabin number too. The FBI worked with Spanish police to meet us when we docked. David was evacuated under protection, and a search of his room revealed a large collection of evidence: photos, documents, and communications linking crew members to criminal groups. This evidence led to 12 crew arrests and exposed a major trafficking ring spanning multiple cruise lines. David lived, recovered, and later published his investigation, which showed how much crime was hidden within the cruise world under the cover of international waters and corporate silence. The company paid fines and changed policies, but denied knowing anything. The ordeal changed me forever. I left cruise ship work and returned to hospital medicine, where I could truly protect patients without fear of corporate pressure. I learned that sometimes keeping the oath to do no harm means risking your career to stand for the truth. If you ever face a medical emergency on a cruise ship, remember the doctor may be under immense pressure to protect the company over you. Trust your instincts, demand evacuation if needed, and know that while the ocean is wide, truth always surfaces when people refuse to be silent. My buddy Jake convinced me to join as deck crew. See the world, meet girls, make money, he said. What he didn't tell me about was the hazing new workers endured in the lowest decks, or that trying to quit could mean vanishing overboard on your last night. My name is Brandon Walsh, and at 20 years old, I believed working on the Royal Caribbean Voyager of the Seas would be the adventure of a lifetime. Instead, it became a nightmare that showed me the real cost of cheap labor at sea. I grew up in a small Ohio town where the main factory closed when I was 16. Most of my friends either stayed for low-wage jobs or went to college with huge loans. When Jake came back from a contract with nice clothes, electronics, and stories of wild nights in exotic places, I thought it was my best option. The hiring process was shockingly quick. I filled an online form, passed a simple health check, and within weeks I was flying to Miami to join a ship carrying 4,000 passengers and 2,000 crew from all over the world. My contract was 8 months with no time off. The pay sounded fair with free room and food and no living costs. But no one told me the truth. That fear and violence controlled the crew, that new workers were misled about conditions, and that leaving before the contract ended wasn't just quitting, it was a death sentence. The company preyed on people desperate for work, and once aboard, we were trapped. Crew quarters were deep below, far from passenger areas, in narrow halls smelling of fuel and chemicals. My cabin was the size of a closet with bunks, a sink, and a bathroom shared with 20 others. Thin metal walls shook constantly from the engines, and the air was either stifling or freezing. In my first week, I was paired with Carlos Martinez, a Filipino man who had been on ships for 10 years. He warned me to keep quiet and not ask questions around certain people. The work was exhausting. 12-hour shifts, scrubbing decks, moving supplies, hauling trash, and fixing equipment, often unseen by passengers. We were invisible, treated more like machines than people. The first real sign of danger came in my second week when I met Dimitri Popescu, a Romanian who had been trying to quit for a month. He signed for 6 months, but after 3, he was done. The pay was eaten up by charges for food and lodging, leaving him nearly broke. He just wanted to go home, but his contract made him liable for training costs, travel, and fees worth more than he could ever repay. Leaving early meant debt collectors back home could seize his family's house. He tried to alert Romanian officials, but calls were monitored. He tried at ports, but crew weren't allowed off without escorts. He was stuck in debt bondage, working under cruel terms with no way out. And he wasn't alone. By my third week, I learned dozens of crew were in the same trap. Many were recruited with promises of good jobs, only to find themselves in modern slavery. Senior officers kept control with money tricks and threats. Hazing rituals reinforced fear, Anyone who resisted got the worst jobs, exposure to dangerous chemicals or punishment shifts until they broke down. My hazing wasn't the worst. I was forced into extra unpaid shifts, insulted daily, and made to handle toxic cleaners without safety gear. But others endured beatings, sexual abuse, or even being locked for hours in storage rooms. The scariest part was knowing there was no oversight. The ship flew flags of convenience, giving us no labor protection. We were in international waters, far from legal safeguards. Injured workers were barely treated, often forced to keep working, and if they couldn't, they were dropped off at the next port with no way home. My breaking point came in week 6 when I saw what happened to Miguel Santos, a Filipino worker trying to organize others to demand better treatment. Miguel had been gathering proof of labor violations, hoping to report them in Jamaica. But before that, he was assigned deep cleaning duty, the most dangerous work, alone in the waste areas, handling toxic waste and dangerous machines. It was a known punishment for troublemakers. On his third night, while I worked nearby, I heard a fight. When I went to check, I saw Miguel being pinned by 3 senior crew, while a security officer held a cloth with chemicals over his face. Miguel fought, but soon went limp. He said these dinners were famous among repeat luxury travelers, and that I should feel honored. The dinner was held in the captain's private dining room, a space hidden behind the bridge I hadn't known existed. Only 12 passengers attended, all of them the richest travelers, old money from New York, tech billionaires, European aristocrats, and oil executives. The conversation was polished and the wine was excellent, but I could feel a tension in the air, as if the real reason for this gathering was yet to come. Captain Morrison, a refined man in his 50s, spoke about maritime tradition and the freedoms of international waters. Later, he began talking about ultimate experiences, which he said were possible only for those with enough wealth and discretion to understand them. He described modern life as soft and boring, claiming that real adventure meant going beyond normal laws and morals. After dinner ended near 11 p.m., he invited us to witness what he called the most exclusive form of entertainment in the world. Many of the guests clearly knew what this meant and eagerly followed him through secret corridors leading deep into the ship, below the passenger areas and crew quarters, to a hidden facility inside the hull. It looked like a hunting lodge, with leather chairs, animal heads on the walls, and large screens showing live footage. At first, the screen looked like a tropical island, but I quickly realized the game being hunted there were people. The captain explained that the ship stopped at a private island owned by wealthy investors, and it wasn't on any charts or logs. He promised that what happened there would never leave the island. The footage showed terrified people running through the jungle, while hunters with high-tech weapons chased them. One passenger, an oil executive, casually explained that the victims were undocumented immigrants, homeless people, and political dissidents, all chosen because no one would miss them. He described the hunts like a sport, with carefully planned challenges to entertain the wealthy hunters. The other guests laughed and bragged about their past kills, rating victims by how long they lasted and how creative their deaths were. Morrison announced that the next day's hunt would include 6 new victims selected for strength and survival skills. Each would be given simple supplies and a head start, while the hunters would use advanced weapons and tracking gear. Watching the hunt on the ship would cost $25,000, while actually hunting cost $50,000 per person. He explained the profits from these activities helped pay for the luxury of the cruise, because passenger fares alone couldn't cover such service. As the night went on, it became clear this was not a new idea, but a long-running system with hunts happening regularly for the rich who wanted this adventure. The others began making plans for the next day. When asked if I would join, I muttered something about needing time to think. I spent the night in my suite, horrified and terrified they would realize I wasn't like them. The next morning I told Eduardo I was unwell and stayed in my room, locking the door, while the small boat left for the island. Through my balcony I saw the hunters leaving, smiling as if going on a holiday. That evening they returned, laughing and cheering about their kills. Hearing them talk casually about taking lives made me sick. I avoided everyone until the trip ended. Once we docked in Fort Lauderdale, I immediately went to the FBI. But crimes in international waters are hard to prove, and finding evidence of such an island is nearly impossible. The investigation is still ongoing, but I doubt real justice will ever come for those victims. I donated Harold's life insurance money to groups helping human trafficking victims and missing persons because I couldn't keep money that gave me access to such horror. Wealth can buy comfort, but it can also open doors to evil beyond imagination. The next time you see elite passengers on a cruise, remember some exclusive experiences exist for terrible reasons. Captain Rodriguez here. In 30 years at sea, I thought I knew every emergency plan that could exist. I had faced hurricanes, engine failures, medical emergencies, and just about every danger possible when carrying thousands of people across the ocean. But when Hurricane Isabella hit us with 40-foot waves and winds over 100 miles per hour, the orders I received from the company went against everything I believed as both a sailor and a human being. My name is Captain Miguel Rodriguez, and after decades commanding ships for Carnival, Hurricane Isabella became the moment that defined my career. I had started as a young officer from Spain, worked my way up through every bridge position, and finally earned the rank of captain after years of experience. By 2018, I was in command of the Carnival Horizon, a massive ship carrying more than 4,000 passengers and 1,500 crew. We were on a 7-day trip in the Western Caribbean when Hurricane Isabella formed suddenly in the Gulf, growing from a weak depression to a Category 4 storm in less than a day. Forecast systems are advanced, but storms can still surprise even experienced captains with sudden changes. By the time we saw how strong Isabella really was, our course had us heading right into it. If I had been allowed to make the call based only on safety, if the company had valued human lives over profits, if I could have acted as my training told me to, I would never have been ordered to leave passengers behind just to protect corporate interests. The first sign of danger came on day 4, when we were about 200 miles southwest of Jamaica. Our weather system showed Isabella strengthening and moving our way. I asked to change course, but Miami headquarters ordered us to continue, saying we couldn't disappoint passengers or cancel plans. They worried about refunds and the impact on future bookings. I warned them Isabella could hit Category 4 with winds over 130 miles per hour. Ships are built strong, but none are designed to face hurricanes, especially with thousands of passengers who have no experience in severe storms. The reply I got was that our ships could handle anything and that I was exaggerating. By day 5, Isabella had become a giant, with an eye wall over 30 miles wide and winds beyond the safe limits of any cruise ship. The storm was moving northwest at 15 knots, and we were going to meet it early on day 6. I begged for permission to head to the nearest port and get passengers off, but headquarters said no, telling me to stay on course to Cozumel. For them, avoiding refunds and costs mattered more than thousands of lives. Their risk charts treated passengers as dollar figures, not people. That evening, I received a secret message from corporate with emergency orders I had never seen before. It was about passenger load management during extreme storms. a cold phrase that really meant deciding who lived and who died if the ship sank. Passengers were divided by ticket class, loyalty status, and how much legal or public damage their deaths might cause. Those in cheap interior cabins were marked as expendable inventory, while suite passengers were priority assets who had to be saved to prevent lawsuits or bad press. If there weren't enough lifeboats, lower-paying guests would be sent to false evacuation zones, lifeboats that didn't work, or areas with no hope of survival. The company's excuse was that in a major disaster, some deaths were certain, and it was better to control who died rather than leave it to chance. At 3 a.m. on day 6, Isabella slammed into the horizon. Winds were 140 miles per hour, waves reached 40 feet, far beyond what the ship was built for. Passengers woke to breaking glass, flooding hallways, and the terrifying groans of the ship's hull under strain. Within an hour, half our engines were dead. Backup power was failing as water flooded in, and we lost communication systems. We couldn't even send proper distress calls. The violent tossing made lifeboat launches impossible. By 5 a.m., the ship's hull was at risk of breaking apart, and the lower decks were flooding faster than pumps could clear. I made the choice to begin emergency evacuation steps, knowing we maybe had 2 hours before the ship would stop working completely or sink. That was when I got my final orders from the company's headquarters. Even with the clear danger to everyone on board, I was told to carry out the passenger load management rules and focus on saving high-value passengers first, while moving others to places where they could not get in the way of evacuation. The company cared more about avoiding lawsuits from rich families than about saving as many lives as possible. The orders said very clearly that passengers in inside cabins on the lower decks should be told evacuation was going smoothly and that staying in their rooms was the safest option. At the same time, passengers in suites and those with elite loyalty status were to be quietly taken to the lifeboats first, since there were only a few that still worked. The reasoning was that wealthy passengers were more likely to have families who would sue the company. I was also told to make sure the ship's data storage systems were destroyed before leaving, so investigators would not find proof of these unfair evacuation rules. The company's lawyers had decided that random passenger deaths in a hurricane could be explained as acts of nature, but knowingly leaving poor passengers behind would lead to criminal charges and cost billions in payouts. At that moment, I had to make the hardest decision of my career. I could obey corporate orders and save the people who mattered most to the company's profit, or I could ignore those orders and try to save everyone I could, no matter what they had paid. Following the orders would keep my career and pension safe, but disobeying would almost certainly bring criminal charges and destroy everything I had built in 30 years at sea. I chose to ignore the company rules and carried out emergency procedures to save the maximum number of lives, not the most profitable ones. I ordered all crew members to help with passenger evacuation, no matter which cabin class people were in. I also made sure families with children were given priority on lifeboats, no matter how expensive their tickets had been. The company's passenger ranking system was cruel, and I refused to follow policies that valued people based on their bank accounts. The evacuation took almost 4 hours in storm conditions that should have made survival impossible. Crew members risked their lives to help passengers reach safety, and many acted with courage far beyond their jobs. In the end, we got more than 90% of passengers and crew into lifeboats before the Carnival Horizon finally gave in to Hurricane Isabella and broke apart by the afternoon. The rescue that followed was run by the U.S. Coast Guard, with ships from many countries working together to collect survivors from dozens of lifeboats spread across hundreds of miles of storm-hit ocean. The final death count was 138 passengers and crew, some lost when lifeboats overturned in the waves and others dying of exposure before help arrived. The company's investigation focused only on my choice to disobey orders, not on the rules that had forced that choice. I was fired immediately and charged with crimes for failing to follow official procedures. The company claimed more people could have been saved if I had followed their system of saving the wealthy first, and they used me as the scapegoat for the whole disaster. But the truth is that Hurricane Isabella showed the cruise industry's real priorities, choosing profit over safety. The passenger management rules I was ordered to follow were a plan to sacrifice poor passengers to protect the company from lawsuits. These rules exist across major cruise lines, hidden in secret documents that captains never see until an emergency. I lost my career, my pension, and my reputation because I refused to abandon people based on ticket price. But I can live with that because I know I chose humanity over corporate greed when it counted most. The cruise industry still makes billions selling the illusion of safety while hiding the fact that lives are valued differently depending on money. The next time you take a cruise, remember that in a real emergency, your ticket price may decide if you are saved or left behind in the ocean. Food poisoning on a cruise ship is every passenger's nightmare. But what I found in the galley's freezer at 2 a.m. made me realize that some illnesses were not accidents. My name is Michelle Thompson, and I was the food service supervisor on the Norwegian Escape for 2 years before I uncovered a planned poisoning scheme that targeted certain groups of passengers for reasons that had nothing to do with health and everything to do with protecting the company. I started working on cruise ships right after culinary school, thinking that managing meals for thousands of people would give me good experience before opening my own restaurant. The Norwegian Escape had more than 200 kitchen staff, making almost 20,000 meals a day across restaurants, buffets, and room service. It was a huge challenge that needed perfect organization and strict food safety to prevent outbreaks that could ruin a cruise and cost millions in lawsuits. The galley never stopped running, with shifts for breakfast, lunch, dinner, and late-night prep for the next day. As supervisor, my job was to handle quality control, inventory, and making sure health rules were followed, supposedly checked by regular inspections. What I discovered was that some of those rules were being broken on purpose, for reasons far from feeding passengers. If inspectors had not been paid off, if I had not been on the night shift during special meal prep, if I had not seen food being deliberately contaminated for certain passengers, the poisoning scheme would never have been revealed. But cruise lines earn billions, and some of that money goes toward making sure problems vanish before hurting profits. The first sign came in my third month when I noticed strange patterns in food poisoning reports given to the medical bay. Normally, food sickness spreads randomly through buffets or bad ingredients, affecting anyone who eats them. But the cases I saw clustered around certain groups: passengers who had complained to guest services, families who had threatened lawsuits, or people who caused trouble for crew or other passengers. The head chef, a French man named Philippe Dubois, brushed this off as coincidence. He said some passengers had weaker stomachs, others overindulged in rich food, and those who complained were naturally more likely to blame us, even if their sickness came from shore excursions or poor hygiene. But as I kept watching the medical reports, I started to see that the timing of the sicknesses was too perfect to be random. Passengers would make complaints or cause trouble, and then within 1 to 2 days, they would be locked in their cabins with serious stomach problems that took them out for the rest of the trip. The medical staff would treat their symptoms, but never really checked where the sickness came from. They usually said it was just travel stomach issues instead of food poisoning. The pattern became impossible to ignore when I compared the illness records with the passenger lists and complaint reports. Passengers who had spoken up about noise, asked for money back, or threatened to post bad reviews were much more likely to get sick than those who stayed quiet. Even worse, I found that certain kinds of passengers were targeted more often. People traveling alone in cheap interior cabins were common victims, as were older passengers who were on fixed incomes and had no family to question what happened. It looked like the targeting was aimed at people who were least likely to fight back or bring outside attention. The real breakthrough happened during my 6th month on board when I was working a late-night stock shift and found a hidden food prep area that wasn't part of the regular kitchen. It was down a service hallway that connected to the main galley, but was kept apart from the rest. The space looked just like our normal kitchen, with the same equipment, but it was being used for something else. I saw several crew members making normal buffet food, but then they added things from unmarked containers stored in a locked fridge. They wore gloves and masks while handling it, which made it clear the substances were dangerous. When I asked one of them what was going on, he looked nervous and told me they were making special meals for passengers with medical diets. But that didn't add up, because they were preparing way too much food for just a few people, and the ingredients weren't anything I had ever seen used for dietary needs in my cooking experience. Over the next weeks, I started recording everything that happened in that secret area, who was involved, what they added, and when those meals were sent out. It was clear this was an organized system. Each batch was labeled with codes linking it to certain dining spots and times. The tainted food usually went out during the midnight buffet, which was popular with late-night snackers or early risers. That setup made it easy to target passengers who were more likely to eat specific foods, like simple dishes that older guests preferred or cheaper options that budget travelers picked. The substances being used looked like drugs made to upset the stomach, but not bad enough to need emergency care or evacuation. The doses were carefully measured so people would be sick for days, but not bad enough to create lawsuits or outside investigations. The worst part was learning how they picked who to poison. The choices were based on daily reports from guest services and security that listed problem passengers or anyone hurting the cruise line's image. These reports turned into target lists for the special kitchen staff, who made sure the right people ate the contaminated food. The whole purpose of this plan was money. Sick passengers weren't buying spa treatments, fancy dinners, or extra tours. More importantly, they were too weak and distracted to complain, demand refunds, or file lawsuits. It also worked as a warning to other passengers. People noticed that those who complained often got sick. So many decided it was safer to stay quiet, even if service was bad. When I finally had enough proof, I faced the same choice every worker does when they find crimes on board. Report it and lose everything, or stay quiet and help harm people. I chose to go to the CDC and gave them all my evidence. Photos of the tainted meals, samples of the substances, and copies of the passenger lists. The investigation that followed brought criminal charges to crew members and massive fines for Norwegian Cruise Line. But most importantly, it revealed how cruise lines use food as a weapon against their own guests, punishing anyone who cost them money. The poisoning of difficult passengers is more common than people think, and it keeps happening because most guests blame their sickness on bad food choices or travel stress instead of a planned attack. The next time you feel food poisoning on a cruise, especially if you recently complained, think about the chance that it wasn't random at all. You might be sick because the company decided you were a problem. The head chef, a French man named Philippe Dubois, brushed this off as coincidence. He said some passengers had weaker stomachs, others overindulged in rich food, and those who complained were naturally more likely to blame us, even if their sickness came from shore excursions or poor hygiene. But as I kept watching the medical reports, I started to see that the timing of the sicknesses was too perfect to be random. Passengers would make complaints or cause trouble, and then within 1 to 2 days, they would be locked in their cabins with serious stomach problems that took them out for the rest of the trip. The medical staff would treat their symptoms, but never really checked where the sickness came from. They usually said it was just travel stomach issues instead of food poisoning. The pattern became impossible to ignore when I compared the illness records with the passenger lists and complaint reports. Passengers who had spoken up about noise, asked for money back, or threatened to post bad reviews were much more likely to get sick than those who stayed quiet. Even worse, I found that certain kinds of passengers were targeted more often. People traveling alone in cheap interior cabins were common victims, as were older passengers who were on fixed incomes and had no family to question what happened. It looked like the targeting was aimed at people who were least likely to fight back or bring outside attention. The real breakthrough happened during my 6 month onboard when I was working a late night stock shift and found a hidden food prep area that wasn't part of the regular kitchen. It was down a service hallway that connected to the main galley but was kept apart from the rest. The space looked just like our normal kitchen with the same equipment, but it was being used for something else. I saw several crew members making normal buffet food, but then they added things from unmarked containers stored in a locked fridge. They wore gloves and masks while handling it, which made it clear the substances were dangerous. When I asked one of them what was going on, he looked nervous and told me they were making special meals for passengers with medical diets. But that didn't add up because they were preparing way too much food for just a few people, and the ingredients weren't anything I had ever seen used for dietary needs in my cooking experience. Over the next weeks, I started recording everything that happened in that secret area, who was involved, what they added, and when those meals were sent out. It was clear this was an organized system. Each batch was labeled with codes linking it to certain dining spots and times. The tainted food usually went out during the midnight buffet, which was popular with late-night snackers or early risers. That setup made it easy to target passengers who were more likely to eat specific foods, like simple dishes that older guests preferred or cheaper options that budget travelers picked. The substances being used looked like drugs made to upset the stomach, but not bad enough to need emergency care or evacuation. The doses were carefully measured so people would be sick for days, but not bad enough to create lawsuits or outside investigations. The worst part was learning how they picked who to poison. The choices were based on daily reports from guest services and security that listed problem passengers or anyone hurting the cruise line's image. These reports turned into target lists for the special kitchen staff, who made sure the right people ate the contaminated food. The whole purpose of this plan was money. Sick passengers weren't buying spa treatments, fancy dinners, or extra tours. More importantly, they were too weak and distracted to complain, demand refunds, or file lawsuits. It also worked as a warning to other passengers. People noticed that those who complained often got sick. So many decided it was safer to stay quiet, even if service was bad. When I finally had enough proof, I faced the same choice every worker does when they find crimes on board. Report it and lose everything, or stay quiet and help harm people. I chose to go to the CDC and gave them all my evidence: photos of the tainted meals, samples of the substances, and copies of the passenger lists. The investigation that followed brought criminal charges to crew members and massive fines for Norwegian Cruise Line. But most importantly, it revealed how cruise lines use food as a weapon against their own guests, punishing anyone who costs them money. The poisoning of difficult passengers is more common than people think, and it keeps happening because most guests blame their sickness on bad food choices or travel stress instead of a planned attack. The next time you feel food poisoning on a cruise, especially if you recently complained, think about the chance that it wasn't random at all. You might be sick because the company decided you were a problem. My name is Detective Samuel Pierce, and I have worked maritime crimes for 15 years with the U.S. Coast Guard Investigative Service. But when our cruise ship stopped at a port that didn't exist on any map, when I realized no other passengers seemed to notice we were somewhere we should never have been, I understood I wasn't investigating a crime after it happened. I was watching one being carried out in real time. I had booked the Celebrity Reflection Cruise as a relaxing vacation with my wife Sarah after finishing a brutal 2-year human trafficking case that nearly broke me. That case involved a network using real businesses to move victims across borders, and it had left me drained and distant in my marriage. Sarah believed a Caribbean cruise would help me recover and reconnect. The Celebrity Reflection was a massive ship with over 3,000 passengers on a 10-day trip to popular Southern Caribbean stops like Barbados, St. Lucia, and St. Vincent, Lucia, and Antigua. Off duty, I should have been able to relax without looking for signs of crime, but years of work had trained me to notice patterns others don't. And if not for a GPS error that revealed our true location, if I hadn't overheard the navigation change, if the captain hadn't accidentally announced a port not found on any map, none of us passengers would have survived what waited at that hidden island. The first clue came on day 7 when the daily newsletter listed our next stop as Paradise Cove, a place I'd never heard of even with my deep knowledge of Caribbean ports. When I asked guest services about it, they gave vague descriptions of a private island with exclusive activities. My training told me to be suspicious whenever secrecy and exclusivity were emphasized, especially when moving large groups of people. I began listening closely to crew conversations, and they seemed nervous whenever Paradise Cove was mentioned. On day 8, while passing near navigation, I overheard Captain Williams arguing with what sounded like a corporate contact over satellite radio. The talk was about deliveries and cargo, not vacations. The captain kept promising that the merchandise would be delivered and in good condition. That night, crew members acted busy with preparations that didn't fit a normal port visit. Security came door to door for safety checks, but instead of looking for hazards, they noted passenger details: age, health, travel companions. I saw them using passenger lists with handwritten notes, sorting people by strength, age, and even market value. It was clear passengers were being categorized as goods, not guests. The next morning, the intercom announced our arrival at Paradise Cove, calling it a private island paradise only for celebrity guests. But when I looked outside, the island was nothing like a resort. It was mostly wild forest with rough docks and warehouse-like buildings. Other ships were already anchored there, and some were clearly cargo ships. Containers were being loaded and unloaded while armed guards stood everywhere. There were towers and radar gear that looked military. As we were taken ashore, I noticed passengers being divided into groups just like on the notes. Families in one group, solo travelers another, the elderly separated from younger adults. Fit, healthy passengers were watched closely. The guides weren't smiling cruise staff, but serious men with earpieces and military haircuts, pushing us along paths into the jungle. The deeper we went, the clearer it became this was no tourist spot. I saw barracks, medical stations built for mass intake, and offices where uniformed staff entered details into computers. Then we reached a clearing where hundreds of other passengers were lined up for processing. People were given medical exams, paperwork checked, and then sent into different holding zones based on their category. It was suddenly obvious. Paradise Cove was a human trafficking hub. The cruise wasn't just a vacation, it was a cover to deliver victims to criminal groups. The sorting showed what each passenger was worth. Young adults were marked for forced labor in hidden camps. Children were marked for adoption fraud or worse. Older passengers were evaluated for their organs, prepared for illegal surgeries. The level of organization was terrifying. The cruise line was a real business, but also a front, using vacations as a way to secretly transport people to buyers. Passengers had literally paid for their own kidnapping, and being in international waters meant no one could easily trace us. I knew escaping alone was impossible. The island was heavily guarded and locked down. But I also knew operations like this always had weak points. I found out the traffickers' communication system could be jammed by the ship's emergency broadcasting equipment. During the chaos of processing, I broke into the radio room and sent a distress call with our exact location and details of the trafficking plan. The Coast Guard and nearby naval ships picked it up and